Geert van den Bosch has continuously stood up for honesty, integrity, and science. He's not afraid to ask hard questions, and he always seems to be largely on target. Some people may argue about the timing of some of the things that he has said, but for me, who has followed him since March of 2021, interviewing him on multiple occasions, even his prediction with regards to the viral variants that would occur didn't happen immediately. It took about 2 years for people to realize, okay, what he said about exactly happened. And so, in the context of some of his other concerns about a new variant, I would hope he's wrong, but I have learned that you have to wait. That's sometimes a concern. But he has come straight at it because there's been so much going on in the news with the complaints about what's happening with measles and the cohorts being unvaccinated and they're driving the measles epidemic. It sounds very similar to what happened early in the pandemic. So, very clearly, leaders haven't quite learned any lessons from the pandemic. And so, as usual, Gert calls it out. And here is what he said on his page, and the link is in the description if you want to see directly the article. Growing vaccine hesitancy should be blamed on vaccine developers, regulators, and public health authorities, not on so called anti vaxxers. This is now becoming a term that I think that it no longer is actually a criticism. It now represents independent thought and research. It's no longer it's no longer negative, so to speak. And here you have a big picture of Gert, and he goes on to make his points. And I'll go through this because I've got a PDF highlighting some of the points that he has made there. It's important to note that I recently again shared one of the statements, which I'll come to at the end, that he said, and I shared it just today, and it got removed for misinformation because he just called it to the point. He's almost too much to the point, and so therefore you can't even say what he says because it gets so many people upset. They don't even acknowledge that what he predicted with regards to the circulating variants is right. They'll just say no, no, that's not correct. I have never seen anything like this. It's almost as if acknowledging any kind of error, any kind of mistake will completely demolish the credibility. And so, what they then do is live in a glass house where they perceive that by denying everything, they maintain their credibility. I think everybody has stopped listening now because it's clear that they don't fully understand the science. And if they did, they would have come back to what he was saying and used his knowledge to try and apply what he had learned and take it forward. There is still definitely an incredible degree of arrogance at the moment. And that's part of the reason why I hope that the leaders, the two people I would want to see in positions of power, similar to what happens with Jay Bhattacharya. He stood up against lockdowns. I think that that was a different kind of challenge, but certainly Gert and Professor Christine Stabel Ben from Denmark, I think, are two voices who I think the public will trust because they're objective and they hold the line on science and they're not afraid of acknowledging where there are mistakes. So let's look at in a little bit more detail what Gert had said. As I pointed out, this was the headline about not anti vaxxers. So he pointed out here the large scale implementation of COVID 19 vaccination during ongoing exposure to the rapidly spreading SARS-CoV-2 virus has significantly contributed to this erosion of public trust in vaccines. That's a very important starting point. And again, I don't know if the scientific community grasps this properly, or if they grasp it, they are pretending they don't. Because there is no doubt after you tell people you only need two, then you only need three, then you only need four, then you need it every 6 months, that the story just kept on evolving and changing. And that does not engender trust. And so what has happened is that the public has lost faith in the COVID vaccines. But because they haven't acknowledged this issue around COVID vaccines, they haven't even tried to answer why people are up now to number 8 or number 9. I don't know what number they're at. They haven't even tried to explain it. And so therefore it doesn't take long for the public to say, well, hold on, I had my childhood, MMR measles vaccines. I haven't needed it since then. So why do I need this every 6 months? It's not even as bad as the flu one. And so this kind of thinking, because there's no good explanation that makes sense to the public, they presume, therefore, that the science around these vaccines must be equivalent to the science around all vaccines. And therefore, they presume that there must be a problem with all of them. This is the extrapolation that has happened in the public. And I have been warning people, saying that you cannot let the public think that they are equivalent. I mean, goodness gracious, when you look at the science with this is functioning more like a therapeutic, not like a vaccine. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying that, meaning that it has an impact in terms of the severity of the illness, but the duration that it acts for and the production of IgG4 is probably the main reason. And that is not typical of how the other mainstay vaccines work. And so if that's not clarified, it is no surprise that people get confused. He then went on to say large-scale human experimentation with and using an entirely new non-sterilizing. What that means is that it doesn't stop infection, and inadequately tested vaccines in an attempt to control a pandemic. And this is exactly what happens. And he's just called it as clear as day. You have to remember, people keep on saying the technology was around for a while. Listen, when you actually look in the detail as to what was done, even to do with the fact that there was a Nobel Prize, when you consider that the mRNA technology was actually developed using pseudouridine, and when they did the vaccine, they used N-methyl pseudouridine. And we know that any alteration in a molecule can have different impacts. And so they were using a new, well, not new, they had tested it before, but not in this context. This was everything about this, including the lipid nanoparticle. Everything was new, novel technology in a virus that very few people can still explain about the characteristics of severe disease. From every angle, you are gambling. And I could just never quite make sense how people don't realize how serious this is. Another point I highlighted here: mass vaccination must always be approached with extreme caution and underpinned by comprehensive risk-benefit analysis. Now, this bit here is really critical in terms of the comprehensive risk-benefit analysis. I'll take what Susan Langlois had said to me, and she was involved in vaccine development in the pharma industry, and she's now retired. But again, another voice that was very clear, speaking out about what she saw as flawed. She mentioned an important statement that I have always remembered. A vaccine is not the same as a therapy, okay? Meaning that if somebody's sick and they need to get better, you can give them medication or treatment and you can accept a degree of risk because they're sick already. However, with a vaccine, you're giving it to somebody who is well. They have nothing wrong with them. There is the potential of a future exposure, but They are well. You cannot have something that makes them sick. Now, this is exceptionally important. It's in the low risk cohorts, the cohorts who weren't getting sick with COVID. We knew who they were. And I cannot understand the logic. We knew who was high risk, we knew where to target, but then you had a whole cohort of people who were low risk, people who had previous infection. Why gamble? It's new. You approach this cautiously. And so at the moment, the perception is that the work has been done, everything has been fine, move along. And I'll be coming in a future presentation. I'm preparing the research on it, where there is a perception that lives were saved. Okay. And that's based a lot on the modeling and the 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 expected numbers of deaths. However, with one of the most highly vaccinated countries who has produced good quality data, when I interrogated it carefully, I was finding that even though things like cardiovascular mortality appear to be down, even that requires some really careful thought, all cause mortality was still elevated. And so something is not right. You can't be saying that everything is back to normal, everything has been protected, but your all cause mortality, even after you count people who had lost their lives, is still above the normal. That's a problem. Now, in terms of the unvaccinated, he highlighted this point, and this is really important. No one should ever be coerced into vaccination. Now, it's not just vaccination, it's any therapy. And I have said recently, and again, this didn't go down very well, people don't like it. As I said, anyone who was individually, organization, government involved in COVID vaccine mandates and they haven't apologized or investigated harm, that to me represents a failure in health advocacy. And my personal view is that those individuals either have to do the right thing, which is that they apologize for the people who took the advice and inadvertently got harmed. And it's not just enough to apologize, you have to investigate. You have to understand why they were harmed, what was the mistake, what was missed. And none of that is happening properly. And so, to me, what that means is that people in that situation are not in the right place for health advocacy because it means a failure of ethics. That's the truth. It's an ethical failure. And you want ethical people advocating for the health of the public because there are so many conflicting interests and that happen. The other reason why I agree completely with what he said, as this one point here, no one should ever be coerced into vaccination, is a very powerful impact which works in opposite to the placebo effect. So the placebo effect is where you can give somebody just water or nothing, powder, they take a tablet and they feel better. And this effect can impact up to 30% or with improvement of symptoms. And it shows you how powerful the mind is in terms of dealing with symptoms and illnesses, that faith that you are going to get better. Well, what is even more dangerous is when it works in opposite. So you have the nocebo effect. And what the nocebo effect means is that if someone believes something is going to cause them harm, it will. Even if you gave them water, saline, and they thought this was poison, a percentage would get harmed because they believed it would harm them. And so if you had a cohort of people who were very hesitant because they were concerned about the safety, it doesn't matter what the reason is. If that group was then forced, mandated, coerced, whatever you want to call it, into taking an intervention, no doubt a significant percentage would have the nocebo effect. And this is a reality. They don't know what the difference is, and you can't ignore it because the injury is real. That's how health works. And this is why we know from a clinical point of view, it doesn't matter what my opinion is about a therapy. If a patient says they are concerned and they don't want it, you definitely don't force them to have it, because you increase the likelihood that something will go wrong. Those are the principles, the ethics that medicine is built upon. And so, as I said before, anybody who, after what has happened, I guess I can forgive people for the fact that they hadn't thought about it. They were scared. They thought that this would make a huge difference. At this point, if somebody still thinks like that, yeah, I mean, it's fine to have a personal opinion on it. That's fine. But do not be in a position where you are advocating for someone else's health. That's my view. You should not be there because you don't have the ethics, you don't have the ethical thinking that is required for that kind of responsibility. The other point I highlighted was there is an urgent need to scrutinize the empirical approach that has traditionally guided vaccine development and to present a balanced, evidence based analysis of vaccine associated risk and benefits. Now, as I said, the damage has been so significant to trust in vaccines that, in a sense, the public wants them to go back to even older vaccines and say, hold on, make sure these are safe, because I want to know that this is the case, because I don't trust you because of what you did before. That's fundamentally what has happened. And the analogy is that trust, and for people who have had this experience, trust is like glass. If you drop it and it smashes, no matter how much glue you use, it will never be the same again. And so, because of the damage that has happened in the pandemic, they now have to go back to the basics of almost all vaccines. And this is why you're seeing what's happening with RFK. RFK used to be sidelined easily by the scientific community. Now he's front and center. That's how much damage has been done. And he's now doing the steps to say, actually, I've always been concerned about these things. I didn't think that they were tested adequately. I thought that this was more of an industry system to produce income. That kind of issue now is at the forefront. And so Geert is going straight on with regards to what he thinks needs to be done. The final point that I highlighted here was the one that got me censored. I mean, what can I say? I was just sharing what he said. And what he said here was, I'll read before: vaccinology, rooted in empirical science, was never intended to involve large scale, poorly tested, non sterilizing vaccines for pandemic control. So, this is the statement. Serious experts must acknowledge that the COVID-19 vaccination program departed from sound scientific practice. So, that was what I had copied. I put it in quotes, and they absolutely hated that statement. And part of the issue is I've spoken to Geert many times, and behind the scenes, and actually sometimes in the interviews, I've asked him about what do other experts say quietly to you. And he said they agree with him. They know he's right, but they can't acknowledge it because it will impact on their position, on their jobs. This is no longer about science. This is about politics. And this is about ensuring that you can't say certain things. You're just not allowed. It's going to cause tremendous harm if there is a perception that there can be no challenge around the science. Couple more quick points here. Coercive vaccination policies undermine public trust and ignore complex biological realities of immune system function. Yeah. And this is what we have seen is that this COVID is such a complex disease. It's such a complex virus. I keep reminding people that we've never seen anything like this in nature. And so it's all the more complex depending on where it has come from. You just don't play around with it. And we're already seeing unusual patterns. Now, for me, I always knew that we had to be careful because my research from 2020 was looking at autoimmunity. The fact that the spike protein was binding to ACE2 and triggering autoimmune responses. And I'm saying, you've got to be careful. Actually, I've said this before, and I don't know if many people get this, but I'll make this point here. When it comes to what I consider to be a parallel disease to severe COVID, it's not actually a viral infection. The best parallel disease that I can see is rheumatic fever in children. In rheumatic fever, they get a strep infection, and the response of the immune system to the bacterial infection can overlap targeting normal proteins in the body. And that autoimmune response to that bacterial infection, it happens in about 3% of children, can then lead to the rheumatic carditis, inflammation of the valves of the heart, inflammation in the brain causing chorea, the skin lesions, all of the symptoms around rheumatic fever is autoimmune. And we treat it with very high dose aspirin and steroids, immunosuppressants. So that was always my thought. So when you think about it that way, and so for those people who are scientific, just reflect, just pull back. Why is there no vaccine yet for rheumatic fever? It's very difficult to create because how are you going to control the immune system? It's already hyper responsive to a bacterial infection, and then you stimulate it more. It is extremely difficult to get the immune system to maintain its balance against this bacteria when the problem is a hyperimmune response. That's my thought on it. And this is why I have always said that this was always something that had to be treated very cautiously and very judiciously. And what they have done, it's just literally being a gambling effect in a casino. That's essentially what has happened because there wasn't a good understanding of the science. Final point here that Geert has said, vaccinology, while a rich and multidisciplinary science, is still far from the holy grail of immune intervention, despite efforts by the vaccine industry and other stakeholders to portray them as such. And this is why, as I said, Geert needs to be placed in very senior positions to try and guide the world through this mess. He is involved in vaccine development for most of his career. He recognizes the limitations, he recognizes the strengths, and he knows that you use it cautiously. You cannot ask for a better blend of individual. If RFK is listening, I'm sure he listens to these videos. If he's listening, you need to get this guy on board. When you have your questions about the safety, when you're looking at issues about autism, you can know that this guy is going to speak the truth. He's not going to be afraid to criticize or identify if there's a problem. That's the kind of scientist that you want in very senior positions. And in reality, we have had the sifting of the scientific community through the pandemic, similarly to what happened with Jay Bhattacharya, Professor Makari, who is now, I can't remember what position he's in. These people had stood up. I expect, say, for instance, Dr. Peter McCullough as well, because he has been such a fighter trying to advocate for patients. This is where you need to have a transition so that we can rebuild the trust, the foundations of science from the base. There is no shortcut. The damage has already been done. We need to find ways to rebuild that trust. And I think and I hope that having the right people in place will make that difference. So, as a reminder, if you want to see this presentation or this document, you can probably go to my Substack as well. The link is there, but it's right here in the link below. Growing vaccine hesitancy should not be blamed on vaccine developers. Should be blamed on vaccine developers, regulators, and public health authorities, not on so-called anti-vaxxers. And there is Geert. Can you believe that they called him an anti-vaxxer? You know, and just a reminder as to who he is when you go to the page. You know, he had his PhD in virology. Then he joined several companies, vaccine development, GSK Biologics, Novartis, Solvay Biologics. He was even among the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation when he worked with them for a while. He worked with Gavi. I mean, this guy has worked with all the international organizations. And so when he steps up and says we need to look at this in a scientific and honest way, why in the world would anyone doubt it? Let's hope for the best. We still have a long way to go to try and rebuild this trust. Have a great evening.